So as we all know, aid agencies and development finance institutions want deeply to stimulate and support social change agents working with the poor. And as we heard Jeff Skoll say yesterday, accomplishing deep social change will indeed require a whole range of actors collaborating with one another. DFIs and aid agencies do have the resources that social entrepreneurs need, or do they? This is some of the questions that we'll be raising here. This session, so therefore, will give both the social entrepreneurs in the room, the NGOs, the businesses, as well as the development finance institutions and aid agencies, a chance to understand the diversity of strategy and approaches, challenges, and questions that we all are addressing in order to be able to give feedback and really go deeper into what solutions might be possible. I think we're all familiar with discussions about the diversity around entrepreneurs being very, very diverse, but I think we don't often talk about just how diverse the development finance institutions and aid agencies really are. And understanding that diversity is going to be key to unlocking the resources that they have. So after introducing our esteemed panel and then framing the conversation, each panelist I've asked to spend 3 to 5 minutes, no more, describing what concretely their agency is doing to support social entrepreneurship and why. And then I hope to spend the bulk of this session after that 15 minutes or so opening really in a dialogue back and forth with you that hopefully will lead us to some concrete answers and suggestions. So with that, I'd like to introduce my panel. Okay, some last-minute changes on how the introductions will go. So in deference to his minority status on this panel, I would like to start by introducing Jörg Hartmann. Jörg is the executive director of GTZ, and as such, he manages GTZ's Center for Cooperation with the Private Sector. As such, he's been able to forge thousands and more partnerships specifically between the private and public sectors. And one thing you don't know about Jörg, it wasn't on his CV, is that he spends a disproportionate amount of his modest German public sector salary raising bonsai trees. Next, we have Ambassador Elizabeth Bagley, who has spent 12 years in the US State Department working under Presidents Carter, Clinton, and now President Obama. Her positions included that of the US Ambassador to Portugal. She's a lawyer, and right now, she's the special representative for global partnerships in the Office of the Secretary of State of the United States. And Elizabeth, one thing you don't know about her is that she was a cheerleader in high school. Namat Shafiq, better known as Minouche, is the permanent secretary of DFID, which I think for those of us that work in the development world, would probably most of us unanimously agree that it's one of the best performing development agencies that there is. They spend roughly $9 billion a year in development aid throughout the world. Before that, Minouche was the vice president for the private sector and private sector department of the World Bank. And probably most importantly, I think, anyways, was the chairperson of CGAP, a little-known microfinance organization also housed at the World Bank, which I know very well. Two things, I guess one thing you don't know about Minouche is that she was made a vice president of the World Bank at age 36, which by many accounts was roughly half the average age of the World Bank vice presidents at the time. One other thing you don't know about her is that she can actually stand on her head for 20 minutes uninterrupted. Rachel Kite, next to me, is the IFC's Vice President for Business Advisory Services. She's actually been leading the IFC's work on developing development impact measures, so that finally that double bottom line at the IFC will actually be able to be measured, which I think is a very powerful and necessary step in the development of this field. Rachel, before that, was one of the leaders in the IFC in terms of developing sustainable performance standards and was known for her work in the environmental sector as well. One thing you don't know about Rachel is that she was the DJ the night that Madonna stripped buck naked in 1984. So just in case you thought all we development bureaucrats were really boring, now you know we're not. Myself, I am currently the CEO of CGAP, which is a principal resource center and standard setter for the field of microfinance, housed at the World Bank. I should also say I think this is my last official event as the CEO of CGAP, because I have been nominated to run OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, for the U.S. government. OPIC is an agency that invests in sustainable development in the emerging markets by supporting U.S. businesses investing abroad. So I'm in this weird, I either have no job or 2 jobs today. I'm not exactly sure which one it was. I'll have to check my BlackBerry and maybe I'll find out. So that is the introduction to the panel. Just a few things I'd like to say as we tee up this panel. As we mentioned earlier, aid agencies, development finance institutions, and social entrepreneurs are all looking to create scalable models, we've heard it all week, and systemic change. And all of them are ready to focus, as we know, on those things that this will require. That's a healthy appetite for risk, a keen focus on innovation, real discipline in terms of performance and measurements of performance, private capital, of course, and partnership, sincere and genuine and generous partnership across public and private sectors. But what we haven't talked so much about is the fact that organizational challenges really make the fit between what aid agencies can offer and what social entrepreneurs need sometimes more challenging than meets the eye. Some of these things include things like size. Aid agencies, because of the nature of their organization, have a real bias towards large size. Big checks, big tickets. It's very difficult for them to work with small sizes. Instruments. Many agencies, their instrument is debt, and debt isn't necessarily the most appropriate instrument for, startup capital. So sometimes their instruments don't fit well. The business models or modalities are often difficult as well. Some agencies, like the regional development banks, for example, they have to work through a government. That's just the way they are. That's their mandate, and therefore it's difficult for them sometimes to operate directly with entrepreneurs. And finally, mandates. In the end of the day, most aid agencies and development finance institutions are political animals, and they have political masters. And that's just a reality of the way they function. It makes them very slow, which I'm sure is a comment that will come up in the Q&A. So those are some of the realities that I think these agencies are dealing with, and that we'll be hearing about more in the few-minute comments that each of our panelists is now going to give us on what is their agency doing in this sector, what are the constraints, and why are you working in this area? And I think we'll reverse the order and end with Jörg and start with Rachel.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Elizabeth. I think that as a multilateral focused on the private sector, with a focus which has become much more prominent in the last decade on development impact while maintaining our financial sustainability. So we don't have a capital call sort of every year. We don't get replenished. We have to make we have to be financially sustainable. We have to make a profit, and those profits get ploughed back into our technical assistance. And those profits get ploughed back into some of our ability to take greater risk in order to prove that markets exist and that market transformation can take place. I think that we find ourselves balancing the constraints that Elizabeth talked about and our appetite for revealing where market transformation can produce development. And that's actually quite a difficult balancing act. We're under enormous political pressure, which we welcome, to show big results, post big results in infrastructure development so that local farmers can get access to market, infrastructure development so that small businesses get access to power, infrastructure development so education and health services are available to more. We're under enormous pressure to do that while reducing GHG emissions. So GHG abatement in middle-income countries, avoidance in low-income countries so that they can grow cleaner and greener. We're under enormous pressure, in addition, to find a solution to the food crisis. So that's the kind of welcome political pressure that comes from our boards, from our 2 shareholders in particular, who are representing the views of their parliaments, who are put in place by you as voters as well as you as opinion leaders. And so the question then is, how do we build up an ecology in our portfolio which both embraces everything from the micro, sort of the investment in Harold Rosen and the Grassroots Business Fund, through to how do we experiment with new business models in key areas, so E&Co and things like this, through to how do we do wholesaling, because we are slow and big and bureaucratic, so what are the wholesaling impact platforms that allow entrepreneurs to get access to local currency finance on good terms. And I think there's still a big role for debt, by the way, and I think that there are fashions and fads in financing, and everybody's very keen on equity at the moment, and we do a lot of equity and microequity, but I think debt is always very important to businesses as they try to establish themselves. So how do we do that? And then how do we do some of the big ticket stuff? So if you took microfinance or microinsurance, we would do fund of funds for microinsurance. We'll do direct investing in small microinsurance to experiment to see what's possible. And then we'll do wholesaling with Standard Chartered, because they can deliver to scale more efficiently and with higher productivity than anybody else, microfinance in local currencies to small and micro entrepreneurs in the backwoods of Pakistan. And I think that trying to be able to tell that story of the mix of risk in the portfolio and the approaches is a big challenge that we have. We could agree to disagree on whether we have enough risk appetite. I think that would be an interesting discussion. And how do we establish a financial supply chain which matches the financing needs of everything from grassroots businesses through the stages of development to quite innovative small and medium-sized companies with the actual types of financing you need as you grow your business. And I think that mismatch is very difficult. And the question, I think, to all of us is how do we work together so you can establish platforms of financing so that you can get in and perhaps get all of the different kinds of financing blended together that you need to grow your business. I don't think that the aid world is particularly good at that. We're not particularly good at that ourselves at the moment. And so I think that there's a lot that can be done. But I suppose the good news and the bad news is that if we think it will achieve development impact, we will work with a social entrepreneur. We would work with Coca-Cola. We would work with Standard Chartered. We would work with some new startup in a very risky. We will do all and of the above if we are clear to ourselves about what impact we think we're trying to have. And I think that's really going to be the driver much more in the future than it was in the past. What is the impact we think we can achieve? And we'll work with whoever the partner, notwithstanding sort of all of our standards of due diligence, in order to achieve that impact. So there should be a bigger space for this community with the IFC, but we've got to be very disciplined about productivity and efficiency in order to really make that space grow.
Thanks. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you. First, it's just a real pleasure to be here, and a real pleasure to be here with Elizabeth, who one of the smartest business decisions I ever made was to lure Elizabeth from the UK to Washington when I was at the World Bank to lead CGAP. So it's particularly ironic and pleasurable to be on this podium with her in the UK when she's about to become a real Washingtonian by joining the administration. I will just say a few words about kind of the major characteristics of DFID, what our priorities are, and what are the special issues that we face in supporting social entrepreneurship. And I should just say on the priorities, as most of you know, there's a general election on in the UK. We are currently what is sweetly termed PERDA, which means that officials can, only do what is, can only reflect the policies of the current administration, but with the caveat that there is an election on, and I think you understand. Okay, let me start with the kind of big characteristics of DFID. The Department for International Development leads the UK's fight against world poverty, and that includes running a major aid program, but it also includes providing policy leadership on issues like trade, anti-corruption, climate finance, the whole array of issues that affect developing countries. We have about 2,500 staff. We spend about £9 billion a year. That's about $15 billion. We have offices in about 50 countries, most of which are in Africa and South Asia because of our strong focus on the poorest. We have three major business lines: a bilateral aid business line, a multilateral business line, and a global public goods business line. The bilateral one is a bilateral aid program in about 100 countries. The multilateral one is we control all the funding to the EU, the UN, the international financial institutions, and that sits under a multilateral part. And then the global public goods is a growing part of our business, which includes the work on climate finance, on global health, our increasingly growing research budget. So those are the three business lines that we run. What are our priorities? I think there's several things that characterize pretty much everything that DFID does. First, we are very focused on low-income countries. We are committed to putting 90% of our bilateral aid program in low-income countries. That only leaves 10% for all the middle-income countries in the world, because our view is they don't need money, they may need other things, but they have their own resources to fight poverty at home, and our money is best used in the poorest countries. We're not particularly sectorally focused. At various times, we have tried to reduce the number of sectors we're involved in. I think we have found that difficult, partly because we're very committed to a country-led approach. And so we think countries need to decide what their sectoral priorities are and then tell us what they want us to focus on. And if you're going to respond to their demands, you have to be available to work in health in some countries, and education in others, and infrastructure in others. So we're not focused in any particular sectors, but we are particularly strong on governance and the social sectors. We're also very committed to aid effectiveness and the effectiveness principles that are embodied in the Accra and the Paris agreements. We strongly support benchmarking on aid effectiveness, partly because we do pretty well out of it, but we think it's very important to have external bodies benchmarking how effective aid is, the work that one does, for example, in benchmarking the G8 on their aid commitments, the work that CGAP does on things like smart aid to see if you're a good donor in the microfinance space. We also think that one of the comparative advantages that we have in the international system is that we see the whole system. We're one of the few agencies in the world that has everything under one roof. So we control about 90% of the ODA, the official development assistance that the UK gives. And so we can join the dots between what's happening in Mozambique or Tanzania or Nicaragua with what's happening in the G20, or what's happening at the UN, or what's happening in the IFC and the World Bank, or what's happening on the climate finance debate and those negotiations. And so we think we have a particular comparative advantage in seeing the entire international architecture and having levers in all those venues and spaces. In terms of other big priorities, I think a bit echoing what Rachel was saying, we are very focused on results. I mean, just to give you an example of the kind of things we're very focused on, in this last year, we got 5 million kids into school. We delivered 7 million bed nets. We train 100,000 teachers and 60,000 health workers. We bought 500 million condoms. 1 in every 4 condoms in Africa is paid for by us. You know that wonderful Victorian expression, lie back and think of England? I don't use that very often, but anyway.
Tweak that, everybody.
We got $50 billion of financing for low-income countries at the London summit of the G20. So this is the kind of scale of deliverables that we're being held to account for and the kinds of things that we care about. But in the current fiscal environment, we are increasingly shifting our focus from results to returns. So we got those 5 million kids into school at an average cost of £60 per head. And that matters to us. That's 2% of the cost of getting a kid through primary school in the UK. And that's a really important piece of evidence that I can use when I'm negotiating with my Treasury about our budget. So the cost effectiveness of intervention, so it's not just about results, but thinking about the returns is really increasingly an important issue for us. And you can imagine why. Where does social entrepreneurship fit into this wider business that I've described? It actually cuts across all the 3 business lines that I've just described: the bilateral aid program, the multilateral work we do, and the global public goods. And I'll give just a couple of examples, and I'm sure more will come up in the questions. But just as one example, our bilateral program in Vietnam is working with the Asian Development Bank in Vietnam to support a challenge fund to support SMEs and social entrepreneurs, particularly around the agricultural sector in Vietnam, to try and develop some new business models. In India, we're working with the Clinton Foundation and some of the generic drug producers in India to get them interested in selling generics at low cost in Africa, and trying to get them to think about African markets in a more aggressive way. We supported something called the Business Call to Action, where we worked with a lot of the big corporates to try and get them to do more bottom-of-the-pyramid stuff. So, as an example, Sumitomo Chemical is now expanding its production of bed nets across from, they're now operating in East Africa. We're helping them move into West Africa, and particularly in Nigeria. MAP International is establishing a mobile banking platform, which is serving 105,000 people in Uganda, providing them access to financial services, which they wouldn't have had otherwise. We also, though, recognize that because of the scale issue, we often need to use innovation funds and challenge funds to reach smaller scale things. So we've just launched a 3-year business innovation facility, which is going to support at least 30 company-led initiatives on inclusive business models in 5 countries, Zambia, Malawi, Nigeria, India, and Bangladesh. We've also been very big supporters of fair and ethical trade. We've long supported the Fair Trade Labeling program to expand fair trade labeling across the UK. And I think it's interesting to note that in this recession, fair trade has actually held up much better than organic. People are still buying, and fair trade markets are still growing, even though people's pocketbooks are much tighter. So I think there's some resilience in that market, which is quite interesting. We've also supported a challenge fund for the garments industry called RAGS, which is inviting bids from NGOs to try and improve working conditions in the global garments industry. So those are just some of the examples of things that we're doing in our various lines of business. I don't think that's me. What are the big issues for us in the social entrepreneurship space? First is scale. I think Elizabeth alluded to that. Our administration budget as a share of the total aid we have to deliver is probably the lowest in the industry. We're at 2%. So our administration costs are 2% of our program. And our Treasury is very generous with us in terms of the aid budget, but our administration budget is being cut 5% every year. So it's very difficult for us to work with very small organizations. And so we're in a much better place if we've got intermediaries to work with. Second, there's the perennial problem that everyone has with working with the large corporates and subsidizing the private sector. And we have to be very careful about what we can legitimately fund and support and what really should be on their balance sheets. And in general, both in supporting things like microfinance institutions and the corporates, having very clear lines about what is commercial and what is not commercial, and making it clear that we're funding non-commercial bits for wider purposes is a very important issue for us and something that comes up in this area quite often. And then finally, just to come back to the issue about returns. I think everyone in the development business is very focused on results now, but actually increasingly in this fiscal environment, it's increasingly going to be about returns. So we need to show that we're delivering these results in an incredibly cost-effective and efficient way. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's very helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. After hearing those two, I have to have a disclaimer, and that is I'm not a development person at all. I'm here representing the State Department and in a new office called, my title is Special Representative to the Secretary of State for Global Partnership Initiatives. So it's SGPI is my acronym for our office. And it basically, what I wanted to do is just go through the 8 priority areas that we're looking at, and which of course includes USAID and partnerships, forging partnerships with a number of private sector and IFIs and everything from diaspora communities to foundations to NGOs to the World Bank to DFID, hopefully, to OPIC, hopefully. Just a number of things, but I'll go through the secretarial priorities and the priorities of the administration, and then I want to focus a little bit on the upcoming Entrepreneurship Summit, which I think all of you would be interested in because it really addresses what we're talking about today. The 8 priority areas of this administration, and in particular the Department of State, are the following: global economic recovery and growth, food and water security, and I can describe the various public-private partnerships we're looking at in any of these, but we'll probably do that in the Q&A. Engaging diaspora communities, a very unusual and really, I think, innovative approach to working on engagement of communities that, for example, the Haitian community. We're doing a lot of work with them, and we will be doing a number of outreach efforts to a number of diaspora communities in the United States. Outreach to Muslim communities, very important, a major priority, and that's where the summit is reaching out to. Increasing energy security, climate change, democracy and human rights, which also includes women's issues, as well as trafficking and other issues that affect labor and human rights. Nuclear nonproliferation. We just had as you know, the Nuclear Security Summit, and we're going to be working with NGOs like Plowshares and others to bring them together with corporations and others that are interested in promoting the START treaty and in moving towards that, hopefully in the Senate. Finally, global health. We're working with PEPFAR, of course, Center for Disease Control, other agencies. There's a global business coalition, a global health coalition. We've just brought them together to talk about ways in which we can move the needle on HIV/AIDS, and in particular on maternal mortality. That's something that we're keying in on. And finally, those are the 8. Now, I just want to focus a little bit on the summit. The summit is a result of the speech that President Obama gave in June in Cairo, which laid out about 16 different initiatives. Of course, he lays them out, and then the State Department and USAID and others, NSC to a smaller extent, has to implement them. So we've been looking at programs and implementation for since last June. One of the initiatives that he announced that was particularly exciting to most people, resonated among especially the Muslim youth, is the Entrepreneurship Summit. It's restricted to Muslim entrepreneurs. We went out and had what they call an ALDAC cable, those of you know, to all our embassies, asking them who have Muslim communities, 180 embassies, and asked them to give us 2 or 3 or 4 Muslim entrepreneurs who would be interested, who have actually done something, who have already started businesses and need to maybe scale up or learn more about how they can improve. And then we had an online competition. So we actually have now 250 entrepreneurs coming in from 5 continents, working with our business leaders, our CEOs and lower, but it's top quality CEOs and top officials. The President will open it. The Secretary of State will make a presentation. The Secretary of Commerce will be there. So it's U.S. government as well as U.S. business leaders. And the whole concept is to not only have a networking for these mostly young entrepreneurs to come in for 2 days, April 26th and 27th, and to meet each other, to network, also to learn certain skills from the business leaders, to talk about best practices, talking about technology and innovation, access to capital, catalyzing youth entrepreneurship, which is really a very big agenda item for the President, mentoring programs, unleashing the power of women entrepreneurs, promoting entrepreneurship in general, social entrepreneurship. So we were very excited about it. It's something that we've never done before and something that I think people are very interested in. That's all part of our Muslim outreach. We're also putting together a committee. It's called the Partnership for a New Beginning because his speech was called A New Beginning. So we'll have a partnership with several companies. We haven't unveiled this yet, but we will be doing it at the summit. So, and we will be able to announce several different partnerships that will take place at that point in time. We're working on water issues, on one of the other things that we did. I don't know if, I know we have some friends here from TED, Technology, Entertainment, and what was the third one? Design. We did a TED conference at the State Department, which was quite phenomenal. If anyone knows the State Department, it's a rather staid place. They don't do a lot of things that are very, outside the box, so to speak. It was my first day, so I can't take much credit for it, but one of our people was really dedicated to doing this, and the secretary loved it. And we had a conference that was, we talked about sustainability and climate change and poverty reduction. Those are the three. We had 3 panelists. And they were phenomenal, of course. We had people, and we invited people from all over all other departments. So we had, I think we could hold 600 people, and we had 850, and they were wrapped around the block of the State Department. So it was quite amazing. But we're looking at doing a lot of things that are forward-looking, outside the box. The secretary is really dedicated, as I'm sure many of you know, to development. She's worked in it all of her life since she met Muhammad Yunus when she was the First Lady of Arkansas. She's always been involved in microfinance, especially when it relates to women. So we have a great opportunity to really make a difference and to really move the needle. And what we're trying to do is engage everyone from within the department to our ambassadors overseas, to training programs for public-private partnerships, to doing training for diaspora engagement. So we are in the middle of just a whole new world, and led by the President and the Secretary, who really see partnerships as the only way to improve the world. We know that, as all of you know, none of us can do it alone. Government can't do it alone anymore. NGOs were never able to do it alone. Certainly corporations, they're looking at it in a different way. We have to be strategic, and we have to work together, and it's coming from both the President, the Secretary, and everyone. And certainly OPIC will, I'm sure, is part of what they do anyway. But it's really something the State Department has never thought of really in that way. But it's really a holistic approach and a whole-of-government approach, working with USAID in tandem, working with all our agencies and within our department. So I'm looking forward to our discussion and to questions, and I can give you more information. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And you're Leslie.
Thank you. I work for GTZ. GTZ is a development company owned by the German government. So it's public sector body. We are not the ministry, we're not in the political driver's seat, but work on behalf of the Ministry for Development Cooperation. Their commissions account for about 80% of our portfolio. We are present in more than 60 countries, about 10,000 employees. 8,000 of them are coming from the developing countries, local personnel, about 1,000 people based in Germany. Our business is capacity development, technical assistance on behalf of the German government, and the basis model is that of bilateral cooperation. That means our programs are based on agreements between the German government and the partner governments. And these agreements are increasingly done within a broader donor community. Last night there was the call for more alignment amongst the donors. There's a huge process going on and donors are coordinating themselves increasingly. However, the basis is usually a contract between the recipient government and the German government, and they agree on sectors and on budgets. And our part is to then do capacity development on the sectors we identified with the partner countries. I said partner companies because I'm a small minority within, not only on this panel, but also within my own company. This work is traditionally a state-to-state work. But 10 years ago, the German government had decided to increasingly include private sector interest in that type of work, setting up one of the larger public-private partnership programs in development cooperation. That was at the same time when DFID launched their first challenge funds and when USAID founded the Global Development Alliance. So these programs, which are directed to the private sector, have been around for about 10 years. And there's considerable experience also within these programs. We've done more than 1,000 projects meanwhile, the average size of the partnership projects we do with the private sector is about 600,000 euros. And the range is from very small things to bigger projects ranging 3 to 5 million euros. Generally, the share of the cost of those projects is 1/3 coming from our budget and 60% coming from private sector. So we're not the main funders, but try to mobilize private sector capital for activities in developing countries. Our program was called the PPP program, Public-Private Partnership. Now, this is a bit misleading because PPP usually means huge private sector participation in dams and railroads and huge infrastructure projects, and that's not what you do. We tried to link private sector engagement, or we're trying to link private sector engagement with bilateral cooperation in all sorts of sectors, from health to agriculture to education, you name it. The experience we have is well, it's a mixed one, to be honest. And I see myself as, because we are a small program in the entire portfolio of bilateral technical assistance. My budget is about 15 million euros a year, and the company turnover is about 1 billion a year. So that's not a big part. It's going to, it probably will increase because we had the elections you're still facing, and the inclusion of the private sector will obviously become more important in German development politics. Yet there are some. Now let's first say some of the advantages of the partnership program. We've seen a lot of quality work, especially in the sectors of education or health. As public agencies, you tend to invest, for example, in education, not very market oriented, but more from a political point of view. And whenever you have a private partner on board, you can actually be sure that there's a bit more market orientation in, for example, educational, vocational training programs you do. We had huge successes because Minouche mentioned the HIV AIDS sector in Africa. We started to partner with companies in Africa developing HIV workplace policies. That has been a huge success, and it's meanwhile the models which were developed in partnerships have been taken up by many companies in Africa. So that really went to scale, and it started in a partnership between development and the public sector in the late 1990s. There have been huge successes in the agricultural value chain work. If you talk about coffee, cocoa, or cotton, this is you're talking about markets and development challenges which are no longer, which can no longer be solved on a national basis. I mean, coffee is the second largest commodity traded on this planet, and there's no way in helping Ethiopia to bring forward to improve their coffee sector activities, because you have to have Vietnam and Peru and a whole lot of other countries of the coffee belt in that program. So you need actually an approach which triggers the whole market, the value chain, the coffee chain, and doesn't have this bilateral state-to-state view, because that's of no use in that sector. So in these areas, I think that development cooperation cannot work without the private sector, because if you use that way, you have to have the Nestlé's, Kraft Foods, Starbucks, and you name them, and the coffee business on this world, and you have to have the big ones, and the big ones on the demand side at the table if you want to agree on standards, measures, whatever you want to do. So there have been huge successes, and the and these successes do come from partnership programs. However, there have been also difficulties. Rachel and Minouche have mentioned that if we work with small companies on a project level, I always get blamed in my organization as the one who stands for private sector project Titus. Small, nice stories all over the place. And at times, if I listen to some of the presentations, or if I read some social entrepreneurial publications, I see a lot of nice, tiny stories all over the place. But that's not really the systemic change we actually need to make. And development policy has changed from grassroots project level to consulting on a meso and a macro level. So internally, although I'm always advocating, surely because that's my program, I'm always advocating partnerships with business and development cooperation. Internally, my colleagues ask me very serious questions, and they say, shouldn't we rather go to the, shouldn't we rather help partner governments to be able to partner with the private sector in that country? Shouldn't we rather try to create the enabling environment by sending experts into ministries in developing countries? And shouldn't we rather try to do interventions on a political meso and macro level than to partner with small businesses in order to really do change? So is our position actually to directly engage with small businesses, be it social entrepreneurs or be it mainstream business, or aren't we the ones who are actually in the position to bring about change on a policy more macro level? And is that not something which really benefits the social entrepreneurs more than if we try to give them grants or help to finance them and then kind of thing? So that is one of the internal discussions we have. My answer is usually that if we want to do really want to bring about systemic change, we've got to do all the three things: the micro thing and the meso thing and the macro thing. Probably not the nano thing, but we've got to bring that together. And if I listen to the discussions at this conference here, I sometimes wonder if people use the term systemic change, if they really think of these three levels we've got to take into account. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Jörg. Well, thank you for that. For all sticking to your times and for giving us that overview on some of the challenges, the challenge that you're facing, the priority trade-offs, and some of the models that have been tested to address those trade-offs and challenges. I think now it's time for us to really get back and do some back and forth here. I'd like to take some questions, a number of questions from all of you, but as your hands start to go up, I'd like to pose two questions to you and to all of you at the same time to be bearing in mind, perhaps as you do some responses. And actually they do sort of echo on what Jörg is just saying, which is, there's lots of great models, there's lots of good intentions, there's some really good experience, as Jörg said, there's some great stories, but yet we're not yet seeing the massive change brought about by social entrepreneurship. So what's needed on your side? What's needed on your side to really make that happen? So that's a question for all of us. And the second one actually loops back on what both Jörg said, but also the other panelists, and that is, is it better to be spending the scarce subsidy money, okay, it didn't sound that scarce with some of the numbers you were talking about, but scarce resources, shall we say, rather than money, focusing on building the enabling environment, the ecosystem, as Jörg said, at the meso and macro level, or should we be focusing on creating more species, if you will, within the ecosystem by creating and building more institutions, organizations? So should it be enabling environment or should it be the micro level? Where are the priorities? Question for you and question for you. Now I see lots of hands going up. So what I'd like to do is take some rapid fire ones and then circle back to the panel and then come back to you again. And I'm happy not to have these be questions. They can be comments as long as they're short. So thank you. Sorry to make you run up the stairs, but can you start at the back and then come back down? The gentleman on the left and on the right. Sorry. What?
Yes, hi, Jason Saul from Mission Measurement. One of the questions I had, it picks up on Manusha's point and also Jorg's, which is if we're really trying to measure public-private partnerships and we're trying to move from, I agree, results to actual returns, what examples or evidence have you seen of measuring the value of public-private partnerships, meaning but for the partnership, these development outcomes wouldn't have happened, or because of the partnership, you had disproportionate impact that was much more efficient or much more impactful than through a pure development program? So I'm interested in measuring the value of partnerships and what lessons you've learned or metrics you've developed.
Okay, it's challenging enough to measure return on investment. I think demonstrating causality or attribution is going to be even more challenging, but I'm sure Rachel has an answer to that one. There was a gentleman on the other side of the aisle over there. Yes, thanks.
Hi, Nick Kafka, Teach a Man to Fish. I heard a lot of talk about supporting private initiatives, and NGOs got a little mention in there somewhere along the line as well. I just wonder to what extent social enterprise, social entrepreneurs really exist in your minds as some kind of distinct category. Because certainly, in the UK, looking at the way the DFID divides up some of its opportunities, it's one side of the camp or the other. And the assumption is that somewhere along the lines there's room for social entrepreneurs. Open question.
Right. I'm going to come over here in about the next round. Okay. So, anybody?
Hi, Sean Holt with Own Ventures. I'm wondering if you can comment on a couple things. One is the nature of transformation inside of your organizations. In my experience working with the State Department and with governments on different levels, what's been difficult for us as social entrepreneurs is engaging and working with timelines and expectations. And it seems like there's a lot of room for civic entrepreneurship, internal entrepreneurship within these organizations so that we can interface more efficiently. And then secondly, is in October, the IFC announced a master cooperation agreement with DEGFMO and Proparco, and I'm wondering if you can comment about some of the work, some of the breakthroughs, hopefully in collaboration across your organizations, and how that might unlock some of the potential that we need to see. Thank you.
That's good. And then two more here, and then we'll go back to you guys. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Mattis Wackernagel with Global Footprint Network. We are at the crossroads of two clashing paradigms. I think one development paradigm that builds on the belief in GDP and growth as the answer to getting people out of poverty. And I would say the other one I would summarize as saying, how can we create wealth and assets? Depending on which paradigm you're in, you make totally different decisions. Like in Africa, people say we need to have 6 to 8% growth to get people out of poverty, but I don't think it's physically possible to make population 6 to 8% more productive every year. So you see GDP growth of 8%, but most of it is liquidation. So actually wealth goes down, income doesn't go to the poorest. So our priority level, our priorities would shift radically whether we maximize and measure for GDP type development or for wealth creation, which includes human wealth as well as natural capital. So my question is, where are you on the spectrum of these paradigms, and how are you adjusting your measures according to these paradigms?
Right.
John Marks from Search for Common Ground. I have a question for Ms. Shafiq. We're a very happy recipient of DFID funding around the world. And we're being told, and DFID has been, in the last 5 years, I'd say the most flexible, the most supportive of social entrepreneurship among NGOs, of any of the funders. I wish the Americans, of which I am a native, were as good in this. But what's been happening in the last year or so, And we've been told by DFID around the world that more and more money is going to the multilaterals, World Bank, UNDP, which frankly are not nearly as flexible or as rapid responding, take a couple of years to make up their mind and the like. And I understand the reason for this is what you called, you know, your continuing shrinking lack of personnel and administration. But it seems to me that you're losing an important sector of what had been a very effective aid program because the NGOs are getting frozen out of this. So I would like you to comment on that, please.
Okay, and then one last one over here, and then we'll move to the other side. I was kind of, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's cool.
Hello, Alberto Vollmer from Venezuela, Project Alcatraz. No, I was just wondering.
Sorry, Project?
Alcatraz has to do with reinsertion of criminals. I was just wondering if the aid agencies sort of have sat down together to work on a common agenda. That's one question. And the second question is that the panel is all Anglo-Saxon. I don't see the French aid agency or the Spanish aid agencies. I just don't know, do they exist?
Multilateral.
Well, I mean, German, it's more or less the same root. And Asian.
And now you're going to complain about the panel being all female too, right? Great. Well, thank you for that. We'll shift to the other side and just shortly, but would you all like to respond to some of these? And I may jump in as well. Jörg, do you want to start? Or just jump around?
I start with the Anglo-Saxon bit. What one should also add is there are good programs from the Dutch and the Swiss. One should, sorry? All Anglo-Saxon. Yeah, well, the
Swiss, Anglo-Saxon.
Spain's been considering to join that type of cooperation for quite some time. I wonder if they've made up their minds, but there have been concepts and talks to the Spanish. Belgium and the Nordics are also involved in those partnership programs. So that's the Western donor community, and you're right. There are multilateral partnership and engagement programs. UNDP needs to be mentioned with what they call the Global Growing Inclusive Business Initiative. There have been activities on the side of UNEP too. So there, for most of the big agencies and donors, there have been more or less similar approaches. Yes, from time to time we sit together and exchange ideas. If we're lucky, we come up with common concepts. I think there are a couple of countries where the coordination of donors works very well in bilateral cooperation. Last week we actually met at Rachel's place a couple of programs who are working with business and business partnerships. So there is an exchange. It's not formalized as it is in other areas, but there is an exchange. One of the other questions, and then I leave the rest to the other colleagues on the panel, if there's a distinct category for social entrepreneurs, something between NGOs and businesses, and I'm afraid there's not, at least not in my mind, to be quite frank. In fact, I'm interested in partnering with businesses of all sorts of business, broad range, from people who are interested to really enter markets in developing countries, from people who source in developing countries, from health business to the automotive and chemical sector, which is obviously important if you're from Germany. So there's a broad range. And to make it very clear, I mean, the interesting point for us is actually the profit-making, the business part of the social business, because that's what we should know about ourselves, that we are not businessmen. I mean, I must say I spent the first part of my professional life in business, so I'm not that much public servant as it looks like. But the interesting thing is, in terms of complementary strengths, we can both bring to the table is indeed the profit, the market-oriented part of it, not the social part of it. I would say we are rather social. We bring all those politically correct social issue mindedness. That's what we bring ourselves. That what lacks to make our approaches successful is the business mindedness. So this is indeed one of the things we are looking for. If a company comes and says our CEO is a philanthropist and he wants to build a school in Tanzania, we say, well, that's nice, let him do that, but get out of my but do that. And we can bring you in touch with some NGOs you can give your money to if you want to do something like that. But that's not what we are aiming at. The other thing is the NGO community is included. I think the most successful approaches are probably the complex approaches which include civil society and form that triangle between public sector, private sector, and civil society. I mean, these approaches are also the most painful approaches, as you all know, but they're probably the most successful ones. And I mean, Rachel, you've been working with in the standards sector, so if you want to set standards, ecological or social standards, you've got to choose that multi-stakeholder approach. I'll leave it with that, and the others may take the more difficult ones.
Yeah, I was going to just ask Rachel to address that also, but also comment on the fact that I think coordinating between a whole agency and another whole agency may be a step too far, and where there's been more success is actually coordinating or collaborating sector by sector. You know, for example, in the microfinance sector, where my organization has been playing that role, but I think other sectors are more likely to be able to do that rather than expecting all of the IFC to work with all of KFW. But Rachel, do you want to take that away?
Just to be very, very brief, and I'm happy to take the details offline. One is that I think that, I'm sort of an advocate within the institution about experimentation in this space, and nomenclature gets in the way. And so I don't use the nomenclature inside IFC. What I talk about is what kind of risk do we want to bear in order to reveal new business models that have the potential for scale and have the potential for breakthrough? What kind of partnerships would we be prepared to facilitate and invest in that have the potential for scale and breakthrough? What kind of fancy uses of concessional finance would we be prepared to experiment with? So that gets me to risk sharing, which allows partnerships to start to reveal that a market exists for energy efficiency, for example. It helps us take an NGO and get them to the point where they are comfortable beginning commercial operations and then hopefully work with them through the growth of a business. It helps us use performance-based measures, so using concessional money on the back of a quasi-commercial venture in order to extend the service to places it wouldn't reach without. So, and I think that I don't want to get into the, what do we call this space, but I can't sort of talk about social entrepreneurship to the board and then talk about impact investment to the board the next month. And we have to frame this in terms that are understood. We're very interested in all of this, but we do a bit of arbitrage on language. So it's not a distinct category, but we've got some experience and we're learning from it, and we are looking for the potential for scale. And so we are looking to not pick winners in terms of companies or initiatives, but sort of to pick winners of business models that might look like they would succeed. And then measuring the counterfactual, measuring the value of a partnership or the value of a new business. I would point you to some of the work on social impact indicators through using performance-based grants for access to finance. I'd be happy to give you information offline, and Laurie Spengler and other people who are involved in this kind of stuff are here. I would also say that for us, we're very interested in being able to aggregate the impact of corporate initiatives, social entrepreneurs, and government aid initiatives and foreign direct investment in terms of telling the story of the Millennium Development Goals. Because frankly, when Brazil stands up in 2015, in New York and talks about whether Brazil has met the Millennium Development Goals, it isn't going to be the story of even the Brazilian Oil Fund or aid transfers to Brazil. It's also going to include what José Lindo has been able to do with the work of the greatest sort of goods distributor in Brazil, and what Nestlé have been able to do in the favelas with women distributors of services, etc. And finding a benchmark of measurement that is able to aggregate all of that so you can actually see who supported what in terms of, that's very important to us. And then our own attribution. If we take 10% of equity of a microfinance institution and we put somebody on the board of that microfinance institution to help them transform to becoming a non-bank financial institution recognised under banking law in a country, is that transformative and systemic? Do we count everything that financial institution did as value add because we took a place on the board, we helped them with their governance, we took equity at a critical time? Or do we just count 10% of what they did? And you can extrapolate that out. And then the counterfactual is that we want to actually attribute to ourselves the GHGs from our portfolio. And so you have an issue. If you take 10% of what the institution did on the upside, you say, or take 100% of what the institution did on the upside, did we create 100% of the GHGs from the activities? So this question of attribution is actually fascinating, and it's taking up way too much of my time at the moment, so I'm very happy if any of you have got great ideas.
10%.
The fight is 10%, and we're going to go to 10%, and that will revise down the numbers of impact in terms of telling DFID, well, we did X, Y, Z. The final thing I would say is that the ecosystem of the discussion inside the institution is constantly evolving, and I think it's evolving in the right direction. But we're only as ever as good as our shareholders, and we're only as ever as good as our stakeholders. And, if you've got the stomach for it, continuing to push us, which some of you in the room do very well, Christine, continuing to push us, I think, is important because we do need to learn, and we only learn by doing.
Minouche or Elizabeth, any words before we go to the next set of questions?
Yes. Quick thing on
answer.
Yeah, I want to have a go at answering Elizabeth's two questions very quickly, just an initial go at them. First, on what's needed for scale. I think it's this issue about being ruthless about costs. Because most of the stuff we do that isn't scalable, it's not scalable because it costs too much. And I think the really good, if I just think in the microfinance industries, the microfinance institutions that I know that have grown fast and gone to scale were ruthless about costs. Yeah. Ruthless about costs. So I think the answer lies in costs. On your second question on do we invest in the ecosystem versus more species? I mean, we do at DFID is we invest in both, right? We make a big investment in investment climate work in lots of the countries we work in. We also invest in species, new innovations, new entrepreneurs. We have own CDC, et cetera, et cetera. I think the problem is not which do you invest in, but the problem is we need to be much more rigorous about letting some of these failing species die and letting the really successful species grow. So be a bit more Darwinian in our ecology. That would be my suggestion. And then on the specific questions about the admin cost issues that DFID faces, I mean, I think there we have, I often say the Department for International Development has lots of money for poor people and very little money for DFID. So, we, in the current fiscal environment where, most government departments are facing serious budget cuts over the next few years, I think there is no option but for us to do our part to save where we can. So I don't think there's much latitude to change that pressure. We have maintained our funding of NGOs and civil society throughout this period. In fact, it's grown year on year, every year, as much as the DFID budget has grown, essentially. But I think what it means for us is that we have to find smarter ways to manage those funds, and that's why I made the point about intermediaries. If we can find intermediaries to carry some of the management costs for us, it's a much better way for us to work in the current environment.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, let's come in on this side. Let's start at the top. Yes.
Hi, my name is Audrey Sellian from Rianta Capital, which is an investment advisory to a family trust. We run social investment portfolios in India, and I'm formerly from UN and some work at USAID. Just a very quick observation. The proof of concept that investment in grassroots social enterprises actually works still eludes us to a certain extent. the demonstrable lack of exit at this point, at least from the financial perspective for those who are incorporating a financial element. It's still very kind of obvious, blaring issue. The question I have is really, given the difficulties that aid agencies have just in coordinating with each other in a specific country context, and there are some where programs start and end, there are lots of untied loose ends after 2 years or 3 years of some work, or the coordination it's high in transaction cost for every agency. The bigger you are, the harder it is. And what can your respective agencies do to interface with, for example, the 80 to 100 impact investors that currently congregate around Indian deal flow? Is there a way for us to successfully communicate about transactions and aggregate the different types of capital that we bring to the table? At the moment, we see very little evidence and opportunity to do that. And then the second small question is, what is the acceptable threshold in percentage for the cost of operations of your field offices, on average, relative to the total amount of capital being dispersed? Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Just a quick question related to that. If you're switching from results to returns, then presumably you need to take on more of an investment mindset than a donor mindset, which means moving from restricted giving to unrestricted investment because you're backing management teams and strategies. If that's the case, don't you need a higher proportion of cost to manage the investment?
Yeah. I would say so, but let's keep going. Some more comments or questions, please.
My name is Heidi Kuhn. I'm a founder and CEO of an organization, a nonprofit called Roots of Peace, and I'm very humbled to be a Skoll Social Entrepreneurship recipient. Someone had, excuse me, asked about how grassroots actually works, and I'd like to honor the gentleman next to me who in September of 1997 led Princess Diana through Bosnia 3 weeks prior to her death, and I think that's a fitting thing to mention here in the UK. It sparked the interest in my home to lift my glass that the world may go from mines to vines, replacing the scourge of landmines with the nectar of grapes. We began our first efforts in gratitude to the United States of America through the Office of Public-Private Partnerships, Weapons Removal and Abatement, PMWRA. They gave me a very small grant to turn an idea into reality of $350,000. It was the first grant they had ever given in public-private partnership in January of 2000. And last month we received $30 million from USAID, expanding that concept of unfermented grapes to Afghanistan, and now working in 26 of the 34 provinces, removing over 100,000 landmines in the Shamali Plains, and employing over, impacting over 100,000 Afghan farmers in 26 of the 34 provinces. My question to all of you is that now that we have grown from a toast to now with GTZ and Asian Development Bank, World Bank, and ADB, how do we leverage this in our room? This is a spring planting season in Afghanistan like none other, and as the estimated 100,000 landmines are removed, how do we engage, collaborate beyond what one tiny NGO can do to bring forth peace from the bottom up in Afghanistan in tandem with our U.S. military, NATO forces, and declaring peace from the bottom up by planting the roots of peace on earth? Thank you.
Thank you.
On a different note, if I may, my name's Nick Southern from Care International. Just in the context of the Dean's opening remarks, actually, in the Skoll World Forum, about the degree of uncertainty that the world has and its futures. And looking at the panel, and thank you for this forum bringing together such a distinguished representation, Anglo-Saxon or otherwise, but some of the more thoughtful development practitioners, if I may say so, from a government point of view. My question relates, and a concern, not just as a British taxpayer, but as a more general global citizen, relates to how you will be informed in the uncertain futures. Now, these are not for us to, as some of us were in the scenario versus strategy meeting at 9 o'clock this morning, not to have that kind of 20-year distant perspective. But it's the amount of monies, as you talk around your organizational pressures and the, not just your organograms, but the amount of monies available to do what you do and the actual transaction cost and the focus on that. How will you be informed from an R&D point of view? How will you, from a research and development point of view, how will you be informed by models? How will you develop or maintain, if you have it now, your learning cultures? We talk of this in the not-for-profit and in for the profit world. We spend a lot of our waking time on much of this. With all due respect to the organizations you represent, that's not one of your characteristics, right? How are you going to do this? And how are you going to do it in our uncertain world?
All the way at the top on the left, sorry to make you run up the stairs. Is that it? I didn't see them.
My name is Ndidi Muneli, and I'm a social entrepreneur based in Nigeria. I have a question for the panel, which is basically from the work I've done as a consultant for some of you and as a social entrepreneur, one thing that worries me is that when I see humongous projects, let's say 5-year projects in Nigeria, that's been very successful, highly publicized, when you go back 5 years later, and the Chemonics and the Nathan Associates and everyone has left, there's very little trace that that project ever existed. And that makes me sad, because I realize how much money has gone into it. And so the question for you is, what can we do to ensure more sustainable and sustainable development succession, and how can we build more indigenous capacity on the ground so that this money that you spend in many of our countries is used effectively, and that we can see lasting institutions that have been strengthened and built after the donor funding has ended?
Thank you. Amen. And one last one here. Thanks.
Thanks. My name is Ben Powell from Agora Partnerships. And I think probably all of us in this room can agree that if we could find efficient ways of unleashing the potential of what we call impact entrepreneurs in the developing world to create social, environmental, and economic value for themselves and the planet, that would be a really good thing. And you know, there's a number of people here at this conference, a great group of us, in fact, who are trying to figure out ways of collaborating around this very issue of supporting small business entrepreneurs. And I guess my question is, when you look at the development of microfinance, and you look at the development of the venture capital industry, both of these industries required significant subsidy, a lot of trial and error, and many years before they reached the scale that they're now, where folks can access commercial capital on both sides. And we don't quite have this for the small and growing business sector. It's still subscale, and yet the vast majority of entrepreneurs are in fact in this space, where they're operating in the formal economy. They need anywhere between $50,000 to $1 million or $2 million. And unfortunately, it's just a very difficult space to deal in because of these scale issues and transaction cost issues. And my question is, do you have a strategy, or you know, how are you as funders who are looking for large-scale change, how are you thinking about this issue, and how can we and groups like the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs effectively engage with you so that we can really help this missing middle sector?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's very important and good. And we'll come back to you one more round with just any last pieces of advice for the agencies up here. But let's hear some quick responses to this. Don't feel obliged to say anything if others have said something already. And then we'll get any last words of advice, and then we'll come for a wrap-up back here again. So any quick reactions to that? Any of those questions?
Yeah, my reaction to the woman from Nigeria who's asking about the sustainability, I think that's really the big problem we have, the biggest challenge we have, and why I think our office was formed, and that is to work with our embassies on the ground. You have to have indigenous NGOs and businesses in order to be able to sustain whatever project you're doing. Corporations, very important. We're dealing with Coca-Cola, for example. We have a program called AWASH. It's the Ambassadors Water Sanitation Hygiene Program. It's being started in Kenya. Well, he obviously can't do it alone. He's working with local schools. He's working with local businesses, and Coca-Cola also, who's a major sponsor, and the Millennium Water Initiative. So it has to be country-led. Also, because it has to, in order to be sustainable, the country has to be invested, and the people have to be invested. So that's what we're trying to do. It's not easy, but that, I think, is the bottom line. You can't have a sustainable, end result. You can't keep it going unless the people are invested.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Just to, I think the point that, the investment advisor, sorry, I didn't catch your name. I think that this is actually fundamental. Just in sort of straight commercial business, the relationship between banker and investor and board and management is one of the most fundamental success elements to growth, wealth creation and jobs. And in this sector, my observation is that there's lots of sometimes politically correct niche demand on the investment side. So-and-so just wants to do equity, microequity. So-and-so's interested geographically in only in 8 countries. Other people are prepared to do, lending, but, not, God forbid, anything more than a 3% return. I mean, so there's all kinds of, there's an ecosystem or a financial supply chain which is extremely convoluted. And then, frankly, social entrepreneurship covers everything, depending on who you're talking to. And so the question is, what's the intermediation that matches, debt, equity, concessional finance, quasi of all of that, with entrepreneurs at different stages of their development, with their different visions and their different attitudes around growth of their business models. And I think that we can do it by issue, and I think we have to do it geographically as well. And I think that we're very keen, in order to be able to grow our own ability to wholesale finance into the sector and to work in specific sectors like sustainable energy or water or whatever. I think we're going to have to come up with platforms that do that kind of intermediation. This may be the last time you ever see a panel like this. The financial crisis has done 2 things. One, it has forced the kind of acronym partnership that somebody down here asked about before. We all have to work together because we're all capital constrained, and we have to mobilise new sources of capital into development in a way that we've never had to before, because the scale of demand has just gone off the deep end, and the amount of capital available is under extreme pressure as well as scrutiny. And so our ability to leverage other forms of capital from middle-income countries, from unusual sources into emerging markets, is going to be one of the proofs of the model, really, going forward. So how do we intermediate the Azerbaijani oil fund into social entrepreneurship? That's one of the big challenges for us now, because traditional sources are constrained. And for me, most of the learning that we have global knowledge, but the local learning which forms the global knowledge, this is coming from, our investment in Pheno, adding 1 million customers through a biometric, a partnership on a month. Right? They're 13 million today. By the time I get out there in October, they're going to have 18 million customers. That's a big learning, right? So our learning comes from our entrepreneurs, and our entrepreneurs the innovation is coming from China, it's coming from Brazil, it's coming from South Africa, it's coming from India, it's coming from places like that. So I think that we may be dinosaurs, but our institutions have to find a way to intermediate the knowledge. The final thing I'd say is that the exit strategy for IFC are robust, well-governed local capital markets in all emerging markets that allow small entrepreneurs to be able to stand a fighting chance of succeeding, let alone growing, which requires a business enabling environment that is non-corrupt, which supports ethical governance, which supports good environment social standards and allows people to have decent work. That's our exit strategy. If the IFC still exists in 50 years, it's because that still doesn't exist. We are back in business in countries and in sectors that we haven't lent into for 6 or 7 years because the markets collapsed and they haven't come back. So we are now doing things like cement plants necessary to build the houses that low-income housing is going to support. We're now doing things that we haven't had to do for 5, 6, 7 years in places we didn't have to do them. And I think the interesting issue is where is the partnership that provides the fabric and the infrastructure that allows a micro-entrepreneur and a social entrepreneur to even exist, let alone grow. And I think that, unfortunately, people like us are going to be needed for a little bit longer. But in the process, we have to reinvent the development industry.
That's good. Do you want to answer these questions or move to closing comments?
As you like. I can feed my response to some of the questions.
Okay, why don't we do that? I think what would be useful is maybe we can incorporate some of the responses to some of these questions into final one major takeaways, 30-second soundbite that I think you want to convey to this audience. Manish, do you want to do that? And then we can
start. Do I do closing comments or just soundbite?
Either one. Soundbite.
Only soundbite?
No, you can take you have the balance of my time as well.
Okay, fine.
Donor coordination,
yes. No, my soundbite is small is beautiful, but big is necessary.
I like it. Elizabeth?
Soundbite. Let's see. I just wrote down four things, maybe 5, for public-private partnerships. Common purpose, common goals. Each partner needs to bring value to the relationship. Must be local investment, buy-in, in order to be then sustainable, and results must be measurable.
Right. Thank you. Jörg?
Well, there's still a couple of questions not answered. Maybe we do that afterwards. Coming from, well, it's a difficult one. One thing I think we need, especially in the social entrepreneurship space, is sobriety. Looking what everyone can actually contribute. Being aware of that we work in contexts where virtually nothing works. And this is one of our challenges. I find it at times, to be honest, difficult if I go around and see that all that agency bashing going on. I mean, we are, as you are, in contexts where virtually nothing works, and that needs to be one of the common grounds. And then I think the partnership agenda is something we should further develop. There's a variety of instruments around, and learning and being well informed is probably one of the crucial things we all have to care for in the future. I think if I could decide, I would invest more development money if it was available in the knowledge management of the people who make the decisions. That's probably true.
Great. Rachel, do you have the last
Well,
point?
I just want to doff my hat to Manoush's Darwinian concept of development, which I think was brilliant. And I think that there's not a lot of rocket science that is still needed. And so I think that collectively it's about evolving. It's an evolution of design, an evolution of the industry, if we're all in one industry of wanting to transform markets to work for the poor. So it's an evolution in design for a revolution in impact.
That's good. Okay, with that, I'd like to maybe just make a few comments to wrap up what I heard people saying, which both from the feedback from all of you as well as from the panel. I heard a lot about pressures and balancing trade-offs and being tugged in two different directions. You know, showing more and more impact and yet doing so within strict greenhouse gas caps, for example, Rachel mentioned. Taking much more risk on the one end, but actually taking less risk because in the end of the day, you got to be sustainable and make money as an institution. Otherwise, you won't be there very long. Doing much more, but doing so with microscopic amounts of staff compared to the amount of money you're trying to spend. 2% Minush mentioned, I think Jörg, you mentioned 15 million in budget. Then there was the trade-off between the country-led approach, which we all agree is critically important, versus the complexities of dealing with multiple partners and versus dealing with the private sector and SMEs, which are fundamentally not the country government. And how do you trade those off? Then I heard from the question answered here, there's one part of us is all about creating wealth, and there's a whole other part of the development world which is really more about alleviating poverty. And do they go hand in hand, and do they suggest the same kind of interventions? Then there's the critical issue of take more risk, be additional, go on the edge, be experimental, but then demonstrating that you're having a positive return on investment, which necessarily means oftentimes going with proven efficient methodologies and principles and partners. Then, of course, there's the whole focusing on the micro end versus the meso and macro end, the ecosystem versus the species. So these are the kind of trade-offs I hear our panelists and others like them struggling with. We heard some models that have been used as ways to address them, you know, convening like the summit that Elizabeth mentioned, bringing partners together in a multi-stakeholder forum, wholesaling with banks, doing funds of funds, doing innovation funds as DFID is doing, focusing on fair trade, focusing on risk sharing between the public and the private sectors such that the private sector can extend services to areas where it would not ordinarily go with that subsidy. So for me, the key takeaways were actually 4, although I like the Darwin one. I might have been tempted to add 5. One that I think is for all of us, and that is one has to be ruthless about costs, because in the end of the day, it's not just about results, but it's about returns. To me, that's one of the most powerful things I think that we all, both funders and entrepreneurs and businesses alike, need to remember. And then I heard 3 specific takeaways for the aid agencies. The first one was really focusing on comparative advantage. Aggregating, I think was said over here, the types of capital working together so that equity accompanies debt, so that grants and TA money accompanies equity, so that all kinds of resources and instruments are aggregated for the benefit of the recipient, the client, the partner. Second, I heard that the collaboration and partnerships and learning, which all agencies need to be doing, is going to require funds that, frankly, are often more scarce resources than funds to make to third-party grants. And then the third I heard which was echoed so beautifully by the woman from Nigeria, is ensuring no matter what happens, that the partnerships, whether they be public or private, domestic or international, and that are engaged, and the approaches engaged, and the models engaged, really do ensure that lasting change is within sight, and that sustainability is what we're focusing on, that something is left behind that is meaningful and powerful, that there's a lasting improvement in crops, there's a lasting improvement, as you said, in the vineyards in Afghanistan, that there's a lasting improvement in girls' education rates, there's a lasting improvement in abatement of climate change and improvement of forests, and that there are lasting partnerships on the ground that can long outlive those of us that set them up. So that's what I took away from it. Thank you all for your contribution. And thank you to the panel.